Dobro večer, ja sam Andi Mijoš, dobrodošli u novo izdanje Preko granice. Ono čega se svijet pribojavao se i desilo. Rusija je izvršila invaziju na Ukrajinu. Lideri zemalja Zapada složno su poručili da je Vladimir Putin vratio rat u Evropu i da će on i samo on biti odgovoran za posljedice. Stanovnike velikih ukrajinskih gradova, uključujući i prijestolnicu Kijev, u ranim jutarnjim satima prije 2 dana probudile su eksplozije. Počela je invazija. Istog dana Ukrajina je proglasila ratno stanje. Do trenutka snimanja ove emisije u ruskom napadu na Ukrajinu, prema podacima Kijeva, ubijeno je više od 100 osoba, a snažne borbe i dalje traju.
Звони маме, говори, чтобы в метро шла.
Вот он, русский мир.
Ruski predsjednik se samo nekoliko minuta prije početka napada obratio naciji i najavio, kako je rekao, posebnu vojnu operaciju u Donbasu, istočnoj regiji Ukrajine. Ipak krenuli su raketni napadi po gradovima širom zemlje. Putinov povod za rat je navodna zaštita ljudi od genocida kijevskog režima. Rusi namjeravaju, kako Putin kaže, demilitarizirati i denacificirati Ukrajinu. Izdao je i dramatično upozorenje stranim silama da se ne miješaju.
Кто бы ни пытался помешать нам, а тем более создать угрозы для нашей страны, для нашего народа, должны знать, что ответ России будет незамедлительным и приведет вас к таким последствиям, с которыми вы в своей истории еще никогда не сталкивались.
Višemjesečne napetosti i prisustvo više od 100.000 vojnika Ruske federacije na granici ipak su rezultirali napadom širokih razmjera. Ruski vojni konvoji u Ukrajinu su prema tvrdnjama Kijeva ušli iz 3 pravca: sa sjevera iz Bjelorusije, sa istoka iz Rusije i sa juga, sa Krima koji je Rusija ilegalno anektirala 2014. godine. Ukrajina je prekinula diplomatske odnose sa Rusijom, a predsjednik Volodimir Zelenski je odmah pozvao lidere zemalja Zapada na osnivanje anti-Putinove koalicije.
Я поговорив з Байденом, Джонсоном, Шарль-Мішелем, Дудою, Наусєдою. Ми починаємо створення антипутінської коаліції. Вже закликав світових лідерів задіяти всі можливі санкції проти Путіна, розпочати масштабну оборонну підтримку, закрити для агресора повітряний простір над Україною. Спільно ми маємо врятувати Україну, врятувати demokratični svijet.
Rusko ministarstvo odbrane objavilo je nakon prvog talasa raketnih napada na ukrajinske gradove da su sistemi protuzračne odbrane, vojni aerodromi i zračne snage u Ukrajini neutralizirani visoko preciznim oružjem. Za svoju specijalnu operaciju su saopćili da ne predstavlja prijetnju za civile u zemlji. Ipak, to visoko precizno oružje pogađalo je i stambene zgrade.
Посмотри эту квартиру, там что-то тоже вам должно быть. А что это? Сейчас я нас побуду.
Napadu je početkom sedmice prethodilo rusko priznanje proruskih pobunjeničkih regija na istoku Ukrajine, samoproglašenih narodnih republika Donjeck i Lugansk. Moskva je u DNR i LNR poslala trupe u, kako su tada naveli, mirovnu misiju. Tada su predstavljene i prve sankcije Evropske unije, pod kojima su se između ostalih našli ruski ministar odbrane, savjetnik Vladimira Putina i 351 parlamentarac koji je glasao za priznanje 2 takozvane republike. Dobar broj analitičara je smatrao da će u slučaju vojnog sukoba Rusi ratovati da prošire teritorije tih takozvanih republika. Napad punih razmjera su ipak najavljivale Sjedinjene države. Na Generalnoj skupštini UN-a, održanoj nakon ruskog priznanja DNR-a i LNR-a, Rusija je bila usamljena u pravdanju svojih postupaka. Redom su poteze Moskve osudile sve zemlje Zapada i njihove saveznice, od najjačih aktera SAD, Evropska unija, Velika Britanija i Japan. Svi oni uveli su i sankcije koje će, kako misle, nanijeti velike štete ruskoj ekonomiji. Kina je, s druge strane, pozvala na suzdržanost. Nakon početka invazije odgovor Zapada bio je oštar. Odmah su najavljene najteže sankcije koje je Evropa ikada uvodila. Masivne ciljane sankcije na ključne ruske privredne sektore i zabranu poslovanja ruskim bankama na evropskom tržištu najavila je predsjednica Evropske komisije Ursula von der Leyen. Širom Evrope najznamenitije građevine bile su osvjetljene u bojama ukrajinske zastave, a čak je i u velikim ruskim gradovima uhapšeno više stotina ljudi koji su izašli na nedozvoljene proteste protiv rata. Pitanje koje se sada nameće samo po sebi je dokle će Putin ići. Neki kažu da je cilj svrgnuti vlast u Kijevu i instalirati ljude odane Kremlju. S nama je Taras Žovtenko sa Instituta slavenskih studija i Nacionalnog instituta za strateške studije u Kijevu. Dobro večer, Taras. Vrlo je teško predvidjeti šta će se desiti, pogotovo kada većina nije očekivala invaziju ovih razmjera. Ali šta vi očekujete? Gdje će se Rusija zaustaviti? Koji je Putinov krajnji cilj?
Good evening, Andy. Thank you for your question. The situation is really hard to believe and really dire. But we all do know that Putin stops only where he is stopped by force. So this is one of the main things to keep in mind while analyzing the developments on Ukraine and France. The invasion of this magnitude is really quite not expected, because we could clearly see that Putin's endgame was his political objectives to reinstall himself as the leader of a superpower, of nuclear superpower, with the USSR in mind and with the Cold War division of the world in mind. So now his actions are just putting him mostly in the shoes of North Korea and its political and economic isolation. And looking at what's going on the battlefields, we can clearly see that initial Putin's plan is starting to cripple apart, because we all know, and again, if we look at all previous Russian military invasions and aggressions into other sovereign states such as Georgia, we can clearly see that their first initial plan is to strike quickly and swiftly. It's been already more than 10 hours of fighting. In the next day or two, if we could keep up this dynamic on the battlefield, I think that Russia is going to shift its strategy more towards, maybe softening its aggressive stance and doing some political moves.
Putin je iznio veoma jasnu prijetnju stranim silama koje bi se eventualno mogle umiješati, i to posljedicama kakve nisu viđene u historiji. Šta to znači? Je li možda riječ o nuklearnoj prijetnji?
It's another argument to strengthen this vision of the situation that their initial military planning is failing, because it's been only 10 hours of fight, and Mr. Putin is talking about nuclear weapons. So in 10 hours, Ukrainian army has put him into the situation where he cannot rely on his conventional troops to give him what he wants in Ukraine. This clearly is, again, the Soviet-style move by the Kremlin. But again, it contradicts to other political statements which we have heard already from Moscow, because Mr. Putin has also stated that it's a self-defense on his side, and he is fighting a NATO in Ukraine. So it's a complete nonsense. So if he is already fighting a NATO, then why should those additional threats be issued again? So we can clearly see that Kremlin is now also looking very closely on the situation on the ground. The Kremlin is closely monitoring the reaction of Western powers, and they would act accordingly, and they would shift their strategies and tactics according to the developments and to the situation on the battlefield, and with the economic and political pressure mounted on Russia right now.
Evropa je najavila nikada teže sankcije za Rusiju koje ciljaju ključne sektore njene privrede i zabranjuju rad ruskim bankama na tlu Evropske unije. Snažne sankcije najavio i red drugih zemalja, prije svega SAD i Japan. Hoće li sankcije biti dovoljne da zaustave agresiju?
if they would be supplemented by very harsh and very hard political pressure, there would be a significant impact on the Kremlin, on Russian position in Ukraine and in the region. Because ultimately, we have to remember that Putin's strategic end game is to reinstall himself as a respected superpower. So he doesn't want to be an isolated superpower whose voice isn't heard in the world. And so economy and money is a significant factor in this situation. But we should keep in mind that Putin's game is a geopolitical game on the first hand. And stopping him on this track is not less vital than stopping his economy and then stopping his tanks on the battlefield. And so when he sees this threat of political isolation, complete political isolation, and maybe the breakdown of diplomatic relations with the key Western countries, he would contemplate. He would think twice before he continues his aggression, because this is not what he wants ultimately. So he wants, after everything settles down on the battlefields, he wants that Mr. Biden calls him. He wants that Mr. Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, calls him and talks to him, and all other key Western leaders. So, and if he understands that this is not going to happen, this would be again a significant factor besides the economic sanctions that would let him put down the weapons.
NATO je odlučio ojačati svoje istočno krilo, ali je sekretar NATO alijanse jasno dao do znanja da trupe NATO-a neće biti poslane u Ukrajinu, iako Ukrajina nije članica. Kako vi gledate na takav stav alijanse?
The alliance, as Europe in general, hasn't seen any no such kind of threat since maybe not even the end of the Cold War, because it was yesterday's assessment. It's been since the end of World War II. The fighting of this magnitude practically in the very center of Europe. And clearly NATO and all other Western European countries and European allies of the United States and the United States themselves simply cannot stand aside. And this is the threat, and this is the challenge which has never been seen before in the modern history. And the best thing in Western reaction, to my mind, is the unification of Western leaders, and this is the so-called collective West, about which Mr. Putin is always talking about. But he creates this collective West by his own hands. And as to the NATO moves, clearly NATO has its obligations to its member states. But nevertheless, its defense weapon systems, they outreach the territory of NATO members, and they reach into the territory of Ukraine. So I think one of the possible moves by the alliance is to not only supply Ukraine with additional weaponry, which works very well in the battlefield, but also helping out with the closure of the Ukrainian airspace, just to cut off Russian air forces from bombing runs and from dropping paratroopers to the battlefields. This would not mean the direct intervention, because, well, it wouldn't mean the interference of any NATO military personnel or weapons in Ukraine. But nevertheless, from the territory of neighboring NATO countries neighboring to Ukraine, there could be provided safe zones, at least for Ukrainian air forces to support our troops. Because we can see that on the battlefield, Russian ground troops are, well, they are losing ground without the heavy support of the artillery or the combat aviation. And so this would be a great helper in this situation to repel Russian aggression.
U slučaju najgoreg scenarija po Ukrajinu da Moskva uspije u svojim namjerama, gdje je kraj? Ko je sljedeći?
Well, I think Baltic states would be next on the target list, because if to compare, for example, situation in Ukraine and in Baltic states, we can see many similarities from the number of the so-called ethnic Russian population in these countries, and to the extent that Kremlin has numerously stated that he sees any NATO forces on its border as a direct, clear, present danger to its security. I think that, and from the military point of view, Baltic states are also a very suitable target for Russian forces. The territory, the military logistics, cutting off sea supplies to NATO troops which are stationed already there, establishing no-fly zones in the region just to prevent the Allied air forces to again to run bombing runs and to support troops on the ground. So this could well be the next target, or maybe at least at the very least the next blackmail issue of the Kremlin, just to again to push its own ideas of the so-called new security architecture in Europe, things which were laid down in this ultimatums, which were produced by the Kremlin last year in December, and I think we would see many more other issues when the Moscow try to blackmail the West if Mr. Putin is not stopped here and now.
Hvala vam za vaše viđenje i što ste govorili za Preko granice.
Thank you.
Ovo nije prvi put da je Rusija pokrenula rat na poziv pobunjenika koje je podržavala. U augustu 2008. godine, tokom ljetne olimpijade u Pekingu, Rusija je pokrenula razarajući kopneni napad protiv svog malog južnog susjeda Gruzije. Gruzijske vlasti su se prije ruskog napada borile protiv proruskih pobunjenika u separatističkom regionu Južna Osetija, koji su granatirali nekoliko gruzijskih sela. Borbe ruske i gruzijske vojske, koje su trajale samo 5 dana, odnijele su više od 700 života i u izbjeglištvo poslale više desetina hiljada Gruzijaca. Nakon 5 dana borbi uz medijaciju Evropske unije dogovoren je prekid vatre. Kremlj je tada priznao 2 odmetnuta gruzijska regiona, Južnu Osetiju i Abhaziju, kao nezavisne države i tamo uspostavio stalne vojne baze. O već oprobanom scenariju razgovaramo sa Natijom Seskurijom, saradnicom Royal United Service instituta iz Londona, najstarijeg svjetskog think tanka posvećenog pitanjima odbrane i sigurnosne politike. Dobro večer, Natija. Da li vas potezi Rusije i agresije na Ukrajinu podsjećaju na situaciju u Gruziji, posebno zbog toga što je invaziji prethodilo priznanje dijelova Ukrajine kao zasebni takozvanih republika?
Thank you very much for having me. In fact, I see lots of similarities when it comes to comparing the current situation in Ukraine and the 2008 war in Georgia. I think in terms of rhetoric as well, Vladimir Putin has used in both cases the claims of genocide, the so-called genocide, which we of course know that in none of the cases were legitimate claims. However, the claims of genocide have been applied in both cases in order to justify Russian military offensive. And so far, I think, especially in case of Ukraine, despite the disinformation efforts, these claims seem like a complete nonsense, and I don't think that this has worked. But I think in both cases, Vladimir Putin claimed that this was about NATO expansion, as he calls it. But I think it was much of a bigger issue in both cases, because as we know, Ukraine and Georgia used to be failed states, and they went through a long path, a complicated path, since the collapse of the Soviet Union to become democracies and to have these aspirations towards the West, to westernize its institutions, and this has been seen by Putin as a threat to Russia's national security. So that's why in the first case, in Georgia's case, Russia decided to use force in order to reverse Georgia's political agenda and political orientation. And now what we see in Ukraine, of course, the scale is much larger, and of course, the stakes are much higher in terms of Ukraine, and we see full-scale invasion. Russia is using ballistic missiles and targeting peaceful country, just like in Georgia. But the end goal is the same. The end goal is to make sure that these countries do not become consolidated democracies. And this is done because Russia is fearing to have neighbors that are striving towards the democratic future. And this may, in fact, be seen by the Russian people, Russian citizens, as an example that they would strive for in the future. So I think there are loads of similarities also in terms of the military operation. And by that, I mean, Russia has not only used conventional warfare tools. Other tools, the so-called hybrid tools, have been applied in both cases. We have seen in Georgia's case, cyber attacks have targeted the critical national infrastructure and government websites. And in case of Ukraine as well, there are several instances where cyber attacks have been used by Russia. And I'm sure that these efforts will be doubled in the future. As well as the disinformation, because Russia has used its media to portray both Georgia and Ukraine now as aggressors, as provocative actors, let's say, targeting the local population. Of course, this is completely false claims, but I think in terms of the strategies that Russia has used so far, there are definitely lots of similarities.
Šta se danas dešava u Gruziji 14 godina nakon što je Moskva priznala Abhaziju i Južnu Osetiju? Rastu li strahovi da se scene iz Ukrajine koje sada vidimo mogu desiti i u Gruziji?
Of course, scenes that we have seen so far are tragic. It's a huge tragedy, and I think Georgians can understand what Ukraine is going through right now the best, because we went through similar struggles, similar challenges and threats and tragedy, of course, the humanitarian tragedy and human loss. Since I have to also mention that despite the fact that the August War of 2008 is known as a 5-day war, the war is ongoing. And by that, I mean that even though the military conflict has ended in August, there are a number of attempts by Russia and primarily the borderization policy, which entails the creeping occupation of Georgian territories, by pushing these so-called borderlines further into the Georgian territory and grabbing the Georgian land. These attempts are ongoing, and these attempts are threatening Georgia's territorial integrity, of course, and the local population on the ground. So these are very alarming attempts from Russia's side, and of course Georgia is committed to resolve the conflict only through peaceful means. But Russia has violated the ceasefire agreement of 2008 a number of times. So there is no indication that Russia is willing to scale down its efforts to undermine Georgia's sovereignty. And of course, other tools that I've already mentioned, such as disinformation, cyber attacks, have been used a number of times. So the situation on the ground is quite alarming in that sense, because of course 20% of Georgia's territories are being occupied right now, and Russia is using this as a leverage.
Šta je prema vašem mišljenju krajnji cilj Vladimira Putina i kako vi gledate na njegovu retoriku za koju iz Brisela kažu da je imperijska?
Yes, the rhetoric has been very aggressive, very alarming. It's not that it's new. His vision is known. But now what we have seen now in these couple of months is an insane amount of disinformation in conjunction with a very aggressive rhetoric towards the West. We have seen that Putin imposed demands to the West that are non-starters, because of course it is impossible that Russia will be given a chance to change NATO's policies and change the open door policy towards the allies. So I think in this sense now we see we are entering very dark times in that sense, because Putin seems to make it seems like he has made a decision to reverse the course of history, and by that I mean that he has mentioned a number of times that he sees Ukraine and Georgia to be part of his sphere of influence, and he wants the so-called Cold War mentality to be back. So all of these attempts that we see right now serve the purpose of digesting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Georgia and Ukraine, primarily because these countries are openly pro-Western. The population of both countries are highly supportive of the integration of their countries into NATO and European Union. And I think this is being seen by Russia as a threat.
Hvala vam što ste govorili za Preko granice.
Thank you very much.
To je sve o centralnoj temi. Sada je zaista vrijeme za neke drugčije vijesti. Slučajno dobijeni naučni podaci pokazuju da život možda zaista proleti pred očima ljudima koji su na samrti. Ekipa naučnika iz kanadskog Vancouvera pokušavala je izmjeriti moždane talase kod pacijenta s epilepsijom. Tokom neurološkog snimanja on je doživio smrtonosni srčani udar, a snimanje je ostalo upaljeno. 30 sekundi prije i poslije smrti moždani talasi su pratili iste šablone kao tokom spavanja ili podsjećanja na uspomene, navodi se u medicinskom izvještaju objavljenom u časopisu Frontiers in Aging Neuroscience. Irak je u drevnom gradu Hatra otkrio restaurirane skulpture koje su uništili militanti takozvane islamske države tokom svoje kratke, ali brutalne vladavine. Snimak uništenja nasljeđa, koji datira iz perioda prije nove ere, objavljen je 2015. godine. Sada, 7 godina kasnije, kulturno blago je obnovljeno. Dubai je predstavio Muzej budućnosti, građevinu za koju tvrdi da je najljepša na svijetu. Muzej je sedmospratna elipsa dekorirana kaligrafijom, a vlada Dubaija ovim putem, kako navodi, institucionalizira budućnost. To je sve za ovo izdanje Preko granice. Hvala vam za pažnju i vidimo se naredne sedmice.